Today we kick off several days of the virtual deep dive into AMP, the world of advanced malware protection. And what Torsten and I are going to be doing in the next little while is setting the scene for you. We're going to be talking about endpoint security at a general level, and we're going to be zooming in on how AMP fulfills that role, and we're going to talk about the market segment of endpoint protection and dive into the alphabet soup of things like EPP and EDR. But one thing at a time. Just to remind ourselves, what makes security different from the rest of the entire networking business is that there's somebody playing on the other team, right? So we always have to keep the attacker in mind here and the attacker's objective, which is to gain access to resources, to systems that the attacker is not supposed to have access to. And while it would be nice to say that we're going to stop the attacker up front 100% of the time, any realistic security practitioner will tell you that 100% efficacy up front is simply not attainable in any reasonable way. And the numbers from Cisco bear this out. So what we're looking at here is statistics from a number of months observed from AMP, with the green portion of the bar representing retrospective detections. In other words, those are things where something initially gained access and then was later determined to be malicious. And we'll talk about how AMP handles that situation in a way that really sets it apart from a lot of the other tools. There are lots of ways of thinking about security. One that has current attention is the MITRE attack framework here. And what's important is that it sort of takes the main chunk of that attack timeline and then breaks it down into a number of pieces or actions that are commonly used by attackers to first gain and then extend and exploit what they've gained, the access to systems in the customer's network. The reason that this is important is because modern attacks, almost without exception, are multi-stage things. And just to sort of use one example, with the link to the Talos blog that describes it in great detail here on the slide. The Cobalt group is an interesting illustration, just quickly, of how malware works. Now this is an active campaign that is primarily focused on actual monetary theft. In other words, they're trying to get banking information, steal access to people's financial accounts, go after the bank accounts directly, as opposed to other approaches where they may be more about leveraging access to the system directly to install a cryptocurrency miner, or maybe they're going after intellectual property, what have you. In this case, the Cobalt group is pretty simple. They're after money. And this typically starts with some kind of document, either directly attached or sent as a URL link. Not all attacks have to do that. You know, if you look at some of our competitors' messaging for a good long while now, they've been breathlessly talking about fileless malware, and you'd think that the entire world has stopped using files or something like that. But in many cases, the fileless piece is only going to be one stage of the attack, and at one point or another, there's going to be some kind of payload or something. As the case may be, the initial sort of entry via some kind of document coming into the network is then crafted to trick or encourage the user to click on it. And then that leads us to step 2, which is going to be some kind of exploit of a vulnerability which may exist on the targeted system. And then that vulnerability is used to kick off some kind of process with a script or other sort of piece of active content. And then The next step there is going to be to use that to load something. Now, let me just point out, in a lot of cases here, notice that this is a script that is running, and then as far as the operating system is concerned, what's happening is it's going to be something like one of the commonly used tools on the operating system. So the reason that attackers like to do this these days is this gets around a lot of the whitelisting-based approaches to defense, right? Some competitors will tell you that the right way to protect a system is to make sure that only trusted software runs, and that sounds perfectly plausible until you realize that trusted software is going to include things like VBScript, PowerShell, etc., which can be used to do almost anything you want to the system, including malicious things. So in this case, they're leveraging something that is known to the operating system and trusted, and then they're going to use it in a nefarious way. And what they then do next is some kind of download stage, which is then going to run in memory and pull down the ultimate payload, whose purpose is to take full control of their target system. And at this point, they can start harvesting passwords, collecting information, and generally profiting from their ill-gotten access to the system. So I lay this out simply as one example among many of modern malware. What's common to very many of the attacks is that the endpoint is in fact the target. And that's important to us because what we're talking about here today is AMP for endpoints. So knowing that the endpoint is the target, that's where a lot of the value is, that's what the customer is trying to protect, it makes sense to have one of the layers of defense be on the endpoint itself. Now, traditionally, that's been handled by one of the established incumbent antivirus vendors. And the reality is that those traditional tools are seeing dramatically declining efficacy. So that's one of the reasons that people are looking for alternatives, and that's one of the reasons that you have not been able to walk through an airport the last couple of years without seeing the airport completely wallpapered with advertising from one of a whole laundry list of startups and disruptors who are playing in the endpoint space and encouraging people to sort of think about shaking things up and replacing their traditional antivirus. The other reason that endpoint presence is important is because of the reality that we now live in an encrypted network. In some networks like Cisco Live Barcelona just recently, over 90% of the traffic there was encrypted all week long. This means that getting visibility into what's going on is dramatically easier if you actually have a footprint on the endpoint, because on the endpoint, the traffic is visible in its unencrypted form before it goes into the network tunnel. So the endpoint is not only the main asset that we're protecting, but it's also a critical piece of continuing to see what's going on around us in this encrypted world that we now live in. The more places we can do that, the better. And the shorthand for that is AMP everywhere. So that means that AMP for endpoints is part of a larger ecosystem that includes the network with firepower malware licenses, that includes our email and web security gateways, that includes the AMP integration in Meraki and other components. One key element here is the integration between AMP and ThreatGrid, which is our dynamic analysis, which the industry pronounces sandbox product. And the integration between AMP and ThreatGrid has been very, very tight for a long time. And the way this works is a lot of what AMP does is going to be based on what it knows about files. And The long and short of it is that in AMP, at any given point in time, there are really three possibilities for a file's disposition. It can be known to be good, which is easy to handle. It can be known to be bad, which is easy to handle. And then the third possibility is it has a disposition of unknown. And that is the hardest to handle because security policy rounds down to permit or deny. And it is also the most common by far. Because again, the reality is that most of the world at any given point in time is going to be unknown. Even though there are days when it seems like it, most of the world is not actually malware. On the other hand, you want to be extremely careful about how you mark files as definitively clean. Right? There should be a fairly high bar for marking something as known to be trusted, which means that something that shows up and just doesn't display malicious behavior is not automatically marked clean simply because of the absence of visible malice. Because after all, the bad guys know how this stuff works. So it's perfectly possible for software that is currently behaving well to later develop malicious behavior. One of the pieces that is extremely important there is to then integrate the AMP disposition lookup with ThreatGrid, which is an attempt to turn unknown files into known files. And the glue that holds all of this together, as is so often the case in our security portfolio, is our Talos threat intelligence team. So both the AMP cloud dispositions and the results of ThreatGrid runs are both visible to Talos and managed by Talos to turn this into our world-class threat detection solution. And of course, that uses external inputs as well, and then turns into those are the results that feed back to the products there. And with Talos, the numbers tell a story. We see more stuff than just about any other place out there. So the deal here, just to recap, AMP does a lot of work up front with a very quick file reputation lookup. Calculates the hash of the file. If it's known to be bad, we can block it right up front. If it's unknown, we can run it through ThreatGrid for analysis. If something that entered the network at a certain point then later becomes a topic of concern, then retrospective events will alert us to that and enable us to automatically respond. So reputations come from the AMP cloud, file analysis comes from ThreatGrid, and retrospection again is driven by the AMP reputation cloud. I should note at this point, and we'll talk about this with the components in just a minute, but whenever we use the word cloud in AMP, that could be an on-premise private cloud, or it could be one of the geographically located public clouds that AMP uses. So here's the private cloud piece, and the equivalent on the ThreatGrid side would be an on-premise appliance. Now I'll go into details of the way those pieces play in just a minute here. The rest of the ecosystem looks like this. Let me just go ahead and drain this. So the reputation lookups are ubiquitous. ThreatGrid integration for file analysis is very widely distributed, and the retrospective events as well. In fact, with the exception of the Umbrella Intelligent Proxy, pretty much everything in the ecosystem supports the entire portfolio. Now, just to look at this process in a little bit more detail, when AMP sees something like a file come in, there's a lookup of the hash and a reputation check. What comes back is one of our three possibilities: good, bad, unknown. And then AMP in policy can take some of the unknown stuff that has dynamic content and then send it for analysis. What comes back there is a result from ThreatGrid, produces a numeric result of threat score, and sufficiently high threat scores can get automatically updated. The term of the art here is poked back to the AMP cloud, so that something that runs at, say, 95 or above on the ThreatGrid score then wins an upgrade in the AMP cloud from unknown to malicious. What gets stored in the AMP cloud are the actual hashes and dispositions, and then the GUIDs of the things where something has been seen there. The GUID lets us then relate that to ThreatGrid, where we can access the detailed analysis. And in the scenario where this is a public cloud deployment, here's where the perimeter falls. And the important part is the update happens sort of on Cisco premises. So this is something that's happening in our systems. It is both automatic, but there's also a human analyst component. So this could be mediated by one of the Talos analysts as well. In the private cloud case, this is something that you would deploy for customers who have some enhanced privacy requirements, who are unable to send information off premise for various regulatory or security reasons. In this case, the AMP cloud actually lives within their own data center inside their perimeter. Notice that the actual conversation is the same. The AMP connector does the lookup to the cloud, which in this case is the private cloud. Again, if policy dictates that we then send it to ThreatGrid for analysis, that happens on premise using the ThreatGrid appliance. And then there's a sort of backup step that's available with the AMP private cloud being able to query the public cloud. If it gets a request from the connector, somebody's trying to look up a hash and our private cloud does not have that hash, it can optionally then forward that request to the public cloud and get an answer back. Now, for particularly privacy-sensitive environments or places that say we absolutely can never send anything to a public cloud entity, you would disable that external reputation lookup. So that would be a completely on-premise air-gapped deployment, as opposed to the mediated, what we often call the proxy mode deployment for the private cloud. For historical reasons, you will occasionally run into references to a hybrid mode deployment, where you have the AMP connector talking to the public cloud, but an on-premise ThreatGrid appliance. This is not a recommended deployment model. And the reason for that is very simple. You're going to have a disconnect then between the reputations in the public cloud and the results that you get from ThreatGrid analyses. The reason for that is that our public cloud will not accept reputation updates from systems that we, Cisco, do not directly control. So even if something runs on an on-premise ThreatGrid appliance and gets a score of 100, that will not turn into a reputation update into a public cloud, only a private cloud. So this does not happen, and that disconnected step is why hybrid mode deployments are very strongly discouraged. There are a couple of reasons why we'll never accept updates here. This is it's a matter of both privacy and trust. Now, there are ways, if you've got people who are in the situation, there are ways of handling it. But if you've got the choice in the deployment, the answer is always to avoid the mixed mode. And you never, ever, ever want to get into this situation where you're talking to a private cloud, but the public threat grid. That is completely unsupported. It is in fact not possible to configure that way. So let's just recap this piece quickly. AMP does a lot of work with reputation lookups. The three possibilities for disposition in AMP's world at any given point in time are good, bad, or unknown. When the AMP endpoint connector says that I need to do something with a file, say it's an unknown file that I need to send for analysis, then what happens is the cloud will send a file fetch to pull it from the endpoint into the cloud, where it can then be submitted to the threat grid piece of the ecosystem. Remember, this works the same for public or private. The feedback from threat grid goes to the AMP cloud, and then that turns into possibly an updated disposition and maybe a retrospective event back to the connector on the endpoint. With the public cloud deployment, it looks like that, and with the private cloud deployment, it looks like that. In the endpoint case, we simply don't handle any hybrid modes at all. The reason that the hybrid mode existed in the first place was due to earlier versions of some pieces like AMP for networks having difficulty handling some of the pieces here. Those problems have long since been remedied, which sort of eliminated any need for a hybrid deployment. So the recommended deployment across the board is either a fully public model where you're talking to the AMP public cloud and you're using the cloud-based threat grid analysis, or fully private, where you're talking to a private cloud on your premise and you're using an on-prem threat grid appliance. Keep it simple. You will run into the mixed mode, again, largely for historical reasons and more prevalent outside of the United States. So that's about deployment models. Let's talk about what we're doing and why we're doing it that way. So as I said, the endpoint market has been sort of shaken up in the last while because the options that are available to customers now go well beyond the traditional antivirus. Now, the endpoint protection platform, the EPP, has traditionally been how this has been a Gartner-defined term that covers largely the sort of enterprise side antivirus and sort of extended security portfolios. The usual suspects, you know, your Symantec's, your McAfee's of the world. Over the last few years, as the efficacy of those tools have declined, people then discovered a need to sort of build things that would catch what the antivirus tools were missing. Gartner identified that market segment, and the name they slapped on it was the Endpoint Detection and Response Capability, the EDR. Now, related to this are a lot of other ways that you can protect the endpoint. It could be with NAC. It could be with solutions that manage the endpoint, that push things through VPN tunnels, that look for sort of user and system behavior analytics, that roll out DNS-based protection, which of course is spelled umbrella. Various options here. We offer the ability to sort of pull all of these pieces together into a coherent architecture where the pieces work together, and that's going to be across multiple operating system platforms. Now, just a quick little word. AMP for endpoint, its original DNA goes back to it sort of originates on the Windows platform, and that is, of course, where most of the attacks are still targeted. So that is where a lot of the development effort is still focused. We do have also a very fine Mac endpoint connector. And Linux is very similar. In fact, the code base between Linux and Mac is broadly shared, so a lot of the capabilities are going to be the same. There is a much more limited functionality Android connector, which is probably not what you want to lead with. Let me put it that way. And then there's also, for managed iOS devices, there's our Cisco Security Connector, which includes this thing that for marketing reasons is called Clarity. But if you notice, it actually reports up to the AMP cloud. The reason for that distinction is, of course, fairly straightforward. Namely, we, in order to keep our partners at Apple happy, we need to be sensitive to their messaging considerations as well, and they're not interested in having anything with the word malware security connector because they go to great lengths to protect their walled garden against malware up front. So the Clarity piece, which reports into the AMP cloud, is about visibility and control. Now, a couple of quick little bits about what's going on here. So across the platforms, we've got the protection and the visibility pieces here. It is primarily delivered as a cloud-based service. And the continuous analysis is, and always has been, a really important piece of the AMP story. So this is how we deal with the reality that sooner or later something is going to get in there. We simply design the product with the awareness that reality is subject to change. And if you're prepared to cope with this, you have a natural built-in advantage over things that assume that you've got a one and done. You make a single point in time decision to let something in or not, and after that you don't worry your little head about it anymore, you move on to the next thing. Because AMP pays attention all the time, we're able to more intelligently respond when threats do actually get in. Now, I mentioned this business about the EPP and the EDR market spaces. So Gartner defined these, and then they discovered more recently something very interesting. Namely, these market segments are evolving together. Actually, let me put that a slightly different way. The upstarts, right, the people who have been plastering the airports with ads, are encouraging people to think about dumping their traditional heavyweight EPP for some kind of next generation platform. And the traditional AV vendors have noticed that their lunch is getting eaten, and so they're trying to add capabilities in response. And what that means is that the sort of advanced capabilities from the EDR space and the sort of more traditional endpoint protection roles are converging into what nobody's slapped a name on this yet at the analyst level, but the sort of next phase of evolution in endpoint security is going to be something that combines aspects of both of these areas. Now, what does that mean for AMP? Well, it actually greatly simplifies our messaging, because it used to be the case that when people asked us whether AMP could be used to replace their AV, that we would go to great lengths to avoid giving a straight yes or no answer to that question, because it really depended on what they were doing. And so we preferred not to open that can of worms. The reason for that, and the reason why historically we have not played in Gartner's EPP Magic Quadrant, is that for a long while they had a lot of things that they were looking for in the way they defined an EPP platform that AMP did not provide and never intended to provide. So if you go back a couple of years and you look at what their criteria were for an EPP, It included not only the anti-malware defenses, but also a whole bunch of other things. You know, whether it be a personal firewall, whether it be anti-spam, you know, all kinds of sort of enterprise features, DLP. So we looked at that and said, well, you know, if you play in Gartner's space and you don't tick all their boxes, then pretty much the only thing you can hope for is to be fairly high in the lower left quadrant for the niche players, which is not where we wanted to be. We looked at how they defined the EDR space, which didn't have a magic quadrant, but it did have market segment coverage from Gartner, and we decided that was a better match for AMP. Not perfect, because AMP does a lot of endpoint protection roles, but it certainly got us into less trouble with the Gartner analysts. Now, what's happened is, in the last couple of years, because of this market convergence between EPP and EDR, a lot of the stuff that Gartner used to think was important in the EPP space fell out of their criteria in the last year. So they no longer look for a lot of the things that AMP did not provide. What replaced them is a lot of the capabilities that AMP does provide. And the long and short of that is that last year, 2018, was the first time that Cisco AMP participated in Gartner's EPP Magic Quadrant because their definition had actually evolved in a direction that is very favorable to AMP. In other words, the whole market, this whole business of EPP and EDR convergence, the market has discovered the need for a product that is remarkably similar to what AMP actually provides. And now I'm going to hand it over to Torsten, who is going to walk you through the EPP and EDR pieces in much more detail. But before we do that, we should probably pause and see whether anything has stacked up in the Q&A panel, or whether anybody wants to raise a hand and jump in interactively.
Hey, Brian, so the Q&A panel looks pretty good, but let's give it a minute and see if anyone wants to raise their hand and have an active question.
I've seen some of the attendees. I'd be surprised if there weren't questions.
Okay, Ibrahim, let's see. Is he off mute? Ibrahim, are you off mute?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, the usual objections are normally really geared towards the EPP, which is the controls. Your firewall, client firewalls, the device control. How do you normally handle that objection of you're lacking those components if you are proposing AMP as a complete replacement of my Symantec or my McAfee, etc.? What would be
the main reason that Gartner has started to de-emphasize a lot of what they traditionally rolled into this sort of big ball of features and called it the EPP is that a lot of what was traditionally delivered by an EPP, like the personal firewall, is now generally available as operating system functionality. So that would be the Windows side firewall, the Mac OS and Linux firewall capability. Really has evolved to the point that having that, the value of them having a third-party tool providing that as an add-on has significantly diminished, and that's not us saying that. That's Gartner. So I would refer people to the sort of evolution of the EPP market definition from the analysts, the Gartners and the Forresters of the world. They don't have to take our word for it.
Right, thanks.
So folks, I don't think I have a way of knocking down your raised hand, so you may need to click the button to take down your hand on your side, please, just so that we don't repeat.
Yeah, I think.
Any other questions, Ryan?
Can you hear me?
Hey, how are you? Yep, we got you.
Hey, I think Cito had a good question. I mean, and to kind of expand on that, there's definitely a perception, even within the customer base, that ThreatGrid as kind of the single source of conviction.
Yeah.
And it's really, I think it's really important to kind of highlight that we have a whole bunch of other methods that we use to convict things outside of ThreatGrid in AMP, right?
Yeah,
so,
and we're going to go through quite a bit of that in the next couple of days. But to your point, Doak, you're right. So Brian brought up earlier, folks, that you know, intelligence comes from a whole slew of places, right? And there are people doing research in many, many ways and areas that end up bringing conviction to bear on the AMP side. ThreatGrid is literally just one of those ways to get information for us to turn around conviction. And see, though, the reason I asked for context is because when you mentioned evasion, especially in the conversation around sandboxing technology like this, evasion is typically pointed at identifying that I am being observed and behaving in a way that will either keep you from observing my true intent as I execute and run, or refusing to execute and run because I'm being observed, or trying to break out of that environment such that I can operate at a level where you cannot observe me. And so the way the architecture is built, and this is what I was referring to, the way the entire ecosystem and architecture is built is such that if ThreatGrid does not observe behavior that would cause the score at its final point of observance to rise to that number of 95, where automated systems take that and then go back and communicate to the AMP cloud that we need to change this position on something that was not priorly known to be malicious. Even if ThreatGrid doesn't observe that and get that high score, there are other fail-safes in place, right? There's a scoring whereby people are notified to come take a look at certain files. There are other things that can be done, and if convicted later, the ecosystem says, that's fine. I don't care if it comes from ThreatGrid, a person, an analyst, an outside source. If we're going to poke this and make it malicious, I still have the data I need to inform all the connectors that have ever queried me about that file. And so rather than use the term evasion, I get what your ask was, but rather than use the term evasion, the ecosystem is designed to really kind of mitigate against, quote unquote, evasion in that scenario.
Right.
Yeah. Let me just sum that up. ThreatGrid, although it is an excellent dynamic analysis tool, can really only ever return behavioral indicators, right? It can tell you what a sample did at a particular time in a particular environment, and it slaps a number on that between 0 and 100. It's perfectly possible to have legitimate software produce a high threat score because some of what it does looks like what malware also does. It's also possible to have extremely malicious software produce a threat score of 0 simply because it didn't happen to display that bad behavior at the time of execution in that particular environment, which is why ThreatGrid provides behavioral indicators and AMP provides definitive dispositions of the file. But there's actually a larger piece that I want to pull in here. If you tunnel in on ThreatGrid, you're missing an opportunity to instead talk up Talos, because the ThreatGrid results feed into Talos, right? They're part of our threat detection and intelligence ecosystem, but they're one part of a larger whole. And the Talos story is a fantastic one. It is an industry-leading threat research organization. So if we spend too much time with the nuts and bolts of one piece of that, namely ThreatGrid, we're missing an opportunity to really push a huge competitive differentiator for us, namely the great folks in the Talos team.
And all the threat intelligence they ingest and or purchase and or automated systems that they run that are outside of ThreatGrid. There's a whole bunch of other things that are looking at that data and convicting, to kind of Brian's and Eric's point. So I think the reason I raised it is it's a common misconception, if you will, and so it's important to kind of double click on that. So thanks, Eric. Thanks, Brian.
No, great point to bring up. All right, I don't see any hands right now. I don't want to rush through this kind of, interactive live ask, but I don't see any hands raised right now. So back to Brian's point, Thorsten, are you ready?
Yes.
All right, it's on on you. Thanks, Thorsten.
So let's see.
I will hand you the ball.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for your introduction. So can everyone see my screen?
Not yet.
Oh, they are sharing. Where is the share? Just looking for the sharing button. Share my desktop. Here it is. So can anyone now see my screen?
Yes, it looks like something very terrible has happened to a bicycle.
Yes, an unexpected error occurred. That's a problem. Okay, so let's start. Yeah, first of all, thanks for being here for the next couple of times in my presentation here.
Thorsten, can you swap screens? Can you swap screens? We're seeing your presenter side.
Once again, please.
We're seeing the presenter view instead of the slide view.
Oh,
at the top of the PowerPoint window, if you can just swap screens, we should be good. Yep, there we go. Perfect. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. Okay. Hello, everyone. So for everyone who doesn't know me, so my name is Thorsten. I'm virtual system engineer, cybersecurity system engineer, and for Endpoint. So what I want to show today is, so malware your company and your products must fit to be successful today. So what it means, so what I want to show you today is, I have endpoint experience for approximately 19 years. What I want to show you a little bit today is endpoint protection and also endpoint detection and response from a little different point of view. What you can see here is, this is an outcome from my last 10 years of experience. So what you can see here, it's really interesting to think about what means company, malware, and products. Company. So what means company? So in the last 10 years, I installed endpoint protection systems at approximately 250 customers. So what I saw is their strategy. That means the strategy regarding malware and also their knowledge regarding malware and also their internal departments. I give you some examples for that. The strategy is like, hey, many customers are really focusing on the protection layer or protection approach. So what that means? So let's think about when endpoint protection started. So the really first AV systems came up a little bit after the year 2000. So what was always the approach? The approach for companies and also for our competitors was bringing information as fast as possible to the endpoint, bringing the signature as fast as possible to the endpoint. This was always the approach for companies and also the approach for our competitors. On the other side, what happened? So the companies got really much information about the changing of malware. So what was their approach? You know, dual vendor strategy, multi-vendor strategy, protection for just everything. Or what is a common strategy? Common strategy also today, if there is maybe a threat event from an endpoint product or from a firewall product or proxy or nothing or anything else. So what the customers is doing? So what I often saw at the customers is when an endpoint generates an event, they are sending an email to an administrator. It was the most common strategy behind threat events. Or sandbox. So many customers, what I have seen is so many customers installed their sandbox in addition maybe to a proxy to their endpoint or to their email gateway. But at the end of the day, they are using a sandbox as an additional scanner. So the question today is now, or the difference is now from the strategy perspective, if a customer is using maybe a sandbox as just a scanner, an additional scanner, an additional protection platform, or is it used as a threat response tool? The next thing is products. So products really changed over the last 15 years. So we know we have more and more security products. Brian already told us about the change of the endpoint EDR theme. Gartner says what EDR is. So the customers always had, and this is also a common strategy, best of breed products. What I want to show today is a little bit, hey, what is the problem with a best of breed approach, and where even you have the best products based on Gartner, which is not, what kind of malware is not detectable using that approach. On the other side, you know, malware completely changed. I think when I started, approximately for the year 2000, the whole signature and engine was just 1.4 megabytes. It includes the signature, the engine, all the stuff you need. Today we know malware is not just file. Malware is more and more just maybe malicious behavior. And now we have the following thing. So if you just have malicious behavior, maybe there is something bad in my environment, but there are no files. The company's strategy does not fit the malware, and also which products they are buying also don't fit the malware, and so this lowers their probability for detection, remediation, proactive things. Let's think about the endpoint. So many customers are expecting the following, or the many discussions I had with customers over the last years is why my endpoint is not detecting a file. I think I had this discussion thousands of times. So let's think about some counters here by Talos. It doesn't matter if it is completely right, but what you can see here is we have 5 billion unique hashes per week. So the process data is approximately 120 terabytes per day. That's really a massive amount of data Talos and their systems are analyzing each day. What I did is the following. I did the following thing. As in started Process Monitor on a normal Windows 10 machine. That was my Surface Pro 4 system, and I just monitored my endpoint for 20 minutes. So what was the outcome? The outcome was 46 million operating system events. So operating system events are file read, file write, process generated, process ended, establishing a network connection, reading or changing something in the registry. So what customers or protection customers now expecting is that a protection product on the endpoint, but also on web and email, is able to compare all that what happens on the endpoint with all the information a security company has in their backend. And just from a counter level here, this is just not possible. So let's think about, so there is maybe a change on your disk, and every time if you have a change on your disk, your endpoint has to query billions of hashes to figure out if the hash is good or not. This is not possible. So the thing is, even your customer has all the knowledge, maybe from all vendors, listed on VirusTotal, and stores all that information in their data center, local or on-premise data center, it also does not fix their problem. That's a common problem with the endpoint protection. So we have the same challenge. But I think it's important to show a customer where this approach is limited. Why such an approach will never be able to fix anything. The next thing is, when we're talking about the endpoint, what you see here in the middle is a timeline, and you see here the start point. It's a great point, 1 to 5, 46 million activities on your endpoint. So the first question here is, when an endpoint should ask a cloud intelligence, maybe our AMP reputation database. So it makes no sense to query for every file type. This would also be, once again, too much. The next thing is on a protection level, configuration. A normal endpoint protection product does not care about a wrong exclusion. So that means if you have a wrong exclusion and the endpoint protection does not scan a file, you don't have any information. The next thing is advanced analytics. So when I should upload a file, maybe to my sandbox. So we know we cannot upload any file. But once again, think about your 46 million operating system events, and let's go back here, 8.7 million file events. So it's just too much. So the endpoint needs a logic and really much intelligence to prevent an overload of your sandbox. The next interesting thing here is now you see that red spot. That red spot here is a threat event maybe by an endpoint protection engine. You see here some generic endpoint protection engines listed, like exploit prevention, machine learning. So machine learning is a really interesting part. So our competitors, we have great competitors, but we have also competitors with really limited features for machine learning. So some competitors say machine learning is just querying virus code. So many customers have really bad RFPs, and they just have a mark, okay, machine learning, but don't know what machine learning is. The thing is here now, the next thing, SIEM. So I saw many customers installing just a huge SIEM. So how they handle their SIEM? So from my experience, they did the following. They pushed as much as possible log data into a SIEM, and they were hoping that the SIEM tells them something, hey, something is bad in your environment or in my environment. The next thing is, you know, one event does not show anything. The problem what I have seen at customers is with new endpoint protection products, they have oftentimes generic engines, generic buffer overflow, generic exploit prevention features, and so on. What they are getting now is a generic event from the endpoint. So the problem for them now is they're getting an event, something is suspicious, or a process is suspicious. So what is missing for them is they don't know if they have a problem or not. That means their solution, their endpoint solution, just sees an event, and they don't have any clue how to handle that event. And the next thing is, we know threat feeds or static and dynamic code analysis on a sandbox takes time. For me, a really interesting question for a customer here is, once again, from a strategy perspective. So maybe you have an USB stick. On your USB stick, you have an indication of compromise files, maybe with 2,000 indications of compromise. So customers with a protection approach are not able to answer that question. Do I have a problem or not? Can I find that observer is anywhere in my environment? And the next thing is also with a firewall, like, hey, sorry, not a firewall, a sandbox. So, you know, sandbox maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes. analyzes the file and maybe figures out something bad with a file. So what is the procedure behind? So the most customers don't care about that. And they also don't have the ability now to look for that behavior on the endpoint because they don't have a threat event. And the threat event cannot be used to detect, to figure out just malicious behavior. So from an endpoint protection approach challenge, we have now the following thing. An endpoint protection approach, the timeline is, just-in-time detection is in one direction. So if the endpoint is not able to detect something, you don't have any information, and you don't have any information also for a threat response approach. The next thing is the time window. The time window for an endpoint protection is maybe a millisecond or second. So why? So you cannot block maybe the execution of a file for minutes or for a longer time. From a functionality perspective, you cannot do that. But if you see the gray spots here, if you have seen the device trajectory, so we have a huge behavior cluster. And once again, what the customer does is, what maybe the customer sees here is just one threat event. That threat event again is sent into a SIM, and it doesn't help. So these are endpoint protection approach challenges. This is vendor independent. Protection approach is limited. So what we want to do now with M4 endpoints? The first thing is here, we are splitting the endpoint into an endpoint connector and into the endpoint backend. So we have our endpoint protection engines, once again, just generic names here, and we have our endpoint management for event policies. The big change, what we are doing here, or what M4 endpoint does is, we are changing an endpoint protection product also to a sensor for my backend intelligence. So what it means, you see on the left side here endpoint monitoring. So we added this monitoring, we added network monitoring, and I think one of the most important things and really the most coolest stuff I have seen here in our product is the command line capture engine. On the right side, we have added intelligence in our product, and we have also connected intelligence. So just one use case here. So why does it make sense? So malware today tries to remove all the things after infection. The cool stuff is here, two things. If there is maybe a new file just available for 2 minutes on the endpoint, we have that information because generating that file is sent to the backend, and the backend now has the ability to analyze that file or to take a look at that file for a longer time period, maybe for approximately 7 days. So what we're doing here is we are moving time and resource intensive analysis procedures away from the endpoint to the backend. On top, we have all that stuff here. That Carlos, our CTA. So what I like here, once again, from a solution perspective at customers. So many customers don't have a plan how to manage non-manageable devices on the network. They don't have a plan for that. And once again, protection. Just one example from the field. I had a customer here in Austria. They have a competitor product as a firewall. They have checkpoints. So they have now more Cisco products, but they think, okay, we are protected. We have anything we need. On the other side, when you are done talking to that customers, they had a problem with ransomware inside the environment. It was, I think, a notebook. It was not always online, and it took the company, I think, 6 months to figure out that infected machine. I don't want to spend too much time here on our products. So what we want to change is here, we want to change a one-direction timeline into a loop. So that means you see here on the bottom left, something comes up on the endpoint. So we want to move that point somewhere. So that means also we have our intelligence. We have intelligence in AMP, we have intelligence in Talos, we have intelligences in the cognitive threat analytics, we have intelligences in Umbrella, we have intelligences in ThreatGrid. So we are connecting that intelligences, and every intelligence now gives us information. And I think our really key differentiator for our competitors is we have the network. I think this is one of the most important things, and also for the future. So what we are now having here, so we have our content, web and email, we have our network, we have third-party integrations, we have Talos, and all they are now together connected as one big intelligence. So where we are adding our endpoint behavior, and what you see here is endpoint event. So that means an endpoint event now is just an additional information for the big context our system automatically generates for the customer. So let's see that here. Finally, what you want to do is, once again, this indicators of compromise. So we are able, you know that already, so we have our indicators of compromise 10. So if there is an indication of compromise, you know threat response, you know our indication of compromise upload availability on M4 endpoint console. For two things, we can block, and also we can search for indications of compromise. Why? Because our products now are not only protection products, they are also sensor for the backend intelligence, and we also have that connected intelligences. So let's go a little bit more into the technical stuff. This here is a real-world example which should show the limitation of an endpoint protection approach. So what you can see here is an email comes into your network. We know even you have the best email gateway, even you have the best sandbox, you have always the old fight between hackers and protectors. Like an easy example here is, so you have maybe an email with a link. So when that email arrives at your email gateway, there is nothing malicious behind that link. What happens now is here is, so your system analyzes that URL. The web server now, or the malicious server knows now, okay, someone opened that link, and approximately 10 minutes later, that link is now weaponized. Just an easy way to trick out sandbox technology. What you see here is, in that case, it was a Word file. So every time the user executed that Word file, one important thing is here. Every file you see here is different. That means, so every time the user opened that Word file, the original EWS.exe was different. File size, file name, and also the icon. So what happens now is WinWord executed that executable. The first executable created that oinfo p11.exe, created an OCX file, and extracted an encrypted and compressed ISO file. The problem here with an endpoint protection approach is now the following. You know, signature. Signature is always reactive. Signature can most time cannot be proactive. So that means if you have, you know, we have heuristics and all that stuff, but at the end of the day, signature is reactive. So the thing is, when now the customer has two problems as with the customers. First of all, these files are removed after infection. They are dynamic, and most time the customer don't have any sample. So, and now if there is a sample available, this sample is uploaded to the vendor analyzes the file, maybe figures out something is bad, but it doesn't help because the next time the infection is different. What happens now is here, So we have evasion into memory. And then, you know, code is downloaded from the internet. The interesting stuff here is with internet connectivity is what is the procedure or what is the strategy for a customer. Are they inspecting HTTPS traffic? One side note, one technical side note here for our M4 endpoint connector. When our connector is connecting to mCloud inside the TLS connection, we don't use HTTP. We are using a binary protocol. So that means if the customer uses a proxy and decrypts our traffic, the proxy, every RFC compliant proxy sees that we don't use HTTP and will drop the connection. And therefore, it's a must to exclude our connections from a proxy. The next thing is here, but what you can see here is once again is like what are problems with web traffic? Partial downloads, you know, HTTP range header. From a usability perspective, that's great. So if you have a greater download and it breaks somewhere, you can just start over on that point where the download has broken and then start over. From a security perspective, the problem is even you have the best engine, the proxy is not able to analyze such a file, or even you have a sandbox. It's also important if a customer has maybe a competitor product. The next thing is script code. You know, web traffic is extremely dynamic, like script code. So maybe you can download script as a file. You can also add script inside HTML code, and you know you will never get a signature for that. There was one example. I forgot what to say. Okay. You see here, so we have many troubles with web traffic, or many challenges, and what we have now is that the endpoint is now not last line of defense, is more important also first line of defense. You know, don't inspect HTTPS traffic. So we know we have our firewall, we know we have umbrella. By the end of the day, the problem here oftentimes is, you see the categories business, the reputation is good, IP reputation is good, but the status of the website is compromised. It's always a problem. So what happens now is here, so the code is downloaded here. So we have a second code injection, and then we have the infection on our endpoint. The interesting stuff now here is the following. You see here that red ring at the end of the infection chain must not be always a file. That could be fileless and also static. And once again here, we have our timeline. Our timeline at the customer. So they have their endpoint. So maybe their endpoint generates a threat event. This threat event is then feeded into their SIEM. And they're hoping their SIEM is figuring out they have a problem. But what you can see here is, when you now want to analyze what happened, with a traditional approach, the website is cleaned up, status is clean, so we have an infected machine, we have all that activity we don't want to know, and afterwards, maybe the malware has removed anything from the endpoint. So we don't know with an endpoint protection approach what happens. From a threat response perspective, we are completely blind. You know maybe something bad on the endpoint, and you just have maybe just one threat event in your SIEM. So what we want to do is, or what is the problem here? You see one summary, short summary, you don't have the entry point. You know you have maybe command and control. Maybe your firewall or the next generation network shows you have command and control traffic, but then you have to figure out which system. And so on and so on. Many challenges here. So let's see what is the difference with M4 endpoints. So we have the timeline again. So we have our monitoring on the endpoint, and what you can see now is here, we are monitoring that activity. So what is not included here is we see email. You know, email will be integrated into threat response. So we see the connection outgoing to the proxy, to the web. We see there is a payload downloaded. We see malicious activity on the endpoint. We monitor all that stuff. So we don't have that gray spot. One thing is here, you know, the 46 million operating system events. Device trajectory does not show anything. That makes no sense. So we are remove common communication between trusted applications where nothing is unknown. So that makes no sense, showing you millions of things inside the device trajectory. It would generate into a completely information overload and would not make threat response as easy as it is today with our product. The cool stuff now here is, what is the outcome here? You know, maybe your system is not online or the system is reinstalled. We don't lose that information. So that means our blind spots here are not blind spots. So maybe they just maybe some gray or something else. So we have that information. And therefore, we are monitoring the file activity, you know, the network connections, the connecting process. So think about the labs in threat hunting workshops. So the first lab with Olympic Destroyer, it looks like so easy on the first step, but think about what is behind, which makes that easy example possible. And two things here, timestamp. So we know what happens when, and what our system is doing is it generates relationship between artifacts. You know what it means? Relationship means we know Acrobat Reader maybe dropped a file. We know which command line was executed by WinRAR. We know a command line here for PowerShell. For PowerShell, this is one, sorry for the old screenshot, you see generic IOC, that is the old name, the new name is Cloud IOC. I forgot to change that screenshot, but I think this is one of the most important things. When I'm talking with a customer, the first question is, who can tell me if this command line argument is malicious or not? And believe me, no one, even at a threat hunting workshop, no one can tell you if this command line argument is something bad. And the next thing is, the next question what I'm asking customers is, does your approach or your strategy include monitoring of command line arguments? Let's go a side information here, what it means. This is one of my, here it is. You know, we have included MITRE ATT&CK framework already in our threat grid. This was an example from the SAVT. What you can see here, a description of the APT29 group. And remember my example with that red circle, what is happening on the endpoint. So that means what happens, or what is the important change for your endpoint strategy when the red circle does not indicate a file, maybe just malicious behavior, like that ATP group here. On the left side, you see here, this group is using 18 techniques. One of them are Windows tools. So what it means? Windows tools means command line arguments. CMD, Windows command line, it's just malicious behavior and not a malicious file. On the other side here, let's think about when talking to a customer, like, hey, so one of my most interesting things is here is, so I have maybe my checkpoint and my checkpoint is fine, or my Palo Alto is fine and I'm secure. Let's think about that example here. The APT29 group uses Twitter and GitHub as a backdoor. And the command and control arguments are inside the image files. So no one can detect it in that image files. And the other side, you see here, has his own system files. So an example for that. So maybe that hacking group changes or replaces your NetStat tool. So why they do that? So every time you're opening a NetStat command, it filters away all the malicious connectivities. Or command line, as you can see here, the hacking group uses excessive command line arguments to infiltrate your endpoint. And I think, therefore, that is my personal opinion is, I think monitoring the command line arguments on the endpoint, processing that information in our AMP backend, comparing that behavior with all we have, our threat intelligence on a worldwide base. This is, I think, one of the most important engines we have. So, and you know, finally, retrospection. So we have our behavior cluster, we have that information, and even the file is not available anymore, our system don't forget that malicious behavior. Okay. Here it is, yes. Are there questions so far for my presentation? Can anyone hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Thorsten.
Okay, yes. So could you please share this APT29 picture as well? Yes, of course. That's public available. I can share it with you. So, any other questions so far?
So when you say behavior cluster, so you're talking about that's the elements of data that we have?
So once again I have to. So my fan from my CPU is so loud at the moment, I really cannot hear anything. Sorry. So once again, please.
Yeah, so the behavior cluster, that's what you're really talking about is all the data that's associated with that particular attack. Is that kind of how you're defining it?
Yes, of course. So for me, the behavior cluster is the thousand things or multiple thousand things we are bringing into relationships, like processes, IPs, URL, and describing really maybe a botnet or a malicious behavior. And that's for me, that's cluster.
Okay. So kind of like observables.
Yes. Observables and the behavior between observables.
Got it. Thanks for that.
You're welcome. So how was my time management?
You're good on time. Looking to see if there are any hands raised, and I don't see any right now.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
So Thorsten, what's the response? So I know you gave this at Cisco Live, but what's the response from customers typically when you walk them through kind of this thought process? Or what questions do they typically have for you?
The result is the following. First of all, Gartner is not so important anymore.
Got it.
So we are talking about Gartner. We know Gartner is okay. We know they do a great job. But what Gartner doesn't show, which once again my personal opinion, Gartner doesn't care about a solution design. They have point of products, and which is the best one. So what we try to show the customer, hey, you have great products, but you have single products, and based on your approach, specific type of threats cannot be detected. And then Gartner is not so important anymore, and they don't rely to Gartner only. And the second thing is just teaching the customer what means threat response. And then the next thing is working without so many Cisco acronyms to make it easier for the customer to understand what is our approach. That really helps.
So, really, so you're saying that the most important thing is kind of educating customers on why the approach needs to be different from what it's been for the past umpteen years. And Gartner's not really reflecting, they're looking at the product, but not necessarily the strategy and approach like you outlaid here, right?
Yes. So when we think about the pyramid of pain, you know, the top of the pyramid of pain is TTPs, techniques, and procedures.
Mm-hmm.
So what I try to do is to understand how is the procedure for a customer, and then asking questions they cannot answer, because I know their strategy does not fit. And once again, your company and the model and your product must fit to be successful today.
Yeah, as I look at, you know, the presentation, what I take away from it, and what I hope, you know, those of you that are on the WebEx are kind of able to see is that the model that we have, the architecture and the model, right, enable us to actually see much more than a traditional endpoint protection model, right, where we are solely relying on large signature files, trying to, you know, get balanced performance versus visibility because of file types, operations that we know we can't inhibit or pause or gate because of performance on the system, and a whole slew of things that Thorsten called out as he ran through the traditional models. But having this kind of hybrid system, right, where there's a cloud-enabled connector that is going to just grab all the data that it can and send it up for offline analysis or offline visibility or some sort of, you know, threat modeling in the cloud, actually ends up enabling us to see more and catch more, right, so that we can detect, you know, different types of attack, more advanced attackers, and the way that they are able to actually exploit systems and stay there and pivot and gather insight and data. And so I think that that's one of the key points that we need to be taking away when you have these conversations with customers, and they seem to be leaning towards a Gartner definition of EPP or EDR, right? Why is one better than the other, or why one is different than the other, or why an approach is needed? I think the model that we should see from this is that we're able to actually see more, detect more, and potentially detect a more advanced attacker because of all the data that we're gathering without regard to disposition, but using the cloud to do that further long-term, deeper analysis. Cloud IOCs can actually be very, very powerful in uncovering indication that something's wrong, and then using the data we have to trace that backwards to the point of entry.
Yeah, it was a great summary, Eric. Thank you. Yeah, I think the important thing is to teach the customer to understand what is necessary today, and it makes it easier for them then to understand our approach, to understand the threat response demo, and it makes it easier coming to a POV And also, and this was really, I saw that so oftentimes at customers. So I have a banking house in Switzerland. They have 5 people in their SOC, full-time employees for their SOC. They have 3 guys. They're doing their whole job is generating correlations in Splunk and building endpoint protection rules which generate threat events and so on. And they already spent 5 years. 5 people, 3 full-time programmers for Splunk, 5 years, and they are not able to do anything similar than our threat response in any way. And that really shows the benefit of our threat response architecture.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because we're we had that come up yesterday. We've got, I think, about 20 customers, you know, at the threat forum, and 2 things. One is there was another example of a customer using Splunk and a second customer using QRadar to basically ingest not only the data from endpoint but from their other tools as well. But what's clear is kind of with that event-based approach that there's still a second level of questions that they need to consider. And it kind of ties into what you're talking about, Thorsten, and that is, you know, they can help the tier 1 analysts with that kind of SIM approach, but then the question becomes, you know, once you get up into a tier 2, tier 3, then what kind of data can they get to really kind of understand what to do? And with the SIM approach, it doesn't. I don't see how they can get there, right? Once they need to kind of dive deep, and so it's pretty interesting that you know, once you start kind of having that conversation that you brought up around process and how they respond to incidents and where they get the data from, it definitely exposes the gap in that, you know, that higher level analyst, if you will.
Hey, Doak, would you kind of equate the SIM is almost for the level 1 analyst, but anything deeper, you're going to have to get to a more experienced, seasoned analyst, but you're probably also going to have to go back to the tools where the data originated from. Yeah,
that's exactly kind of what came up, Brandon. Is that, you know, they're dealing with so much data, in so many events that they can, you know, they're lucky to get through even the actionable events that are coming out of the SIM, right? And they're not necessarily having the time to get back and dig deep once they identify a few that they want to look at.
Right.
So I think that was kind of the takeaway that I took from it. But I think every customer probably approaches it differently based on, you know, how much resource they have and how many people in the SOC and blah blah blah. So
yes, exactly.
It's just interesting. So I know we're, you know, really encouraging, or we wanted to make sure that this virtual deep dive was as interactive as possible. So if you guys, you know, want to, if you have questions or statements or you have an opinion, you know, we can certainly unmute you and let you guys chime in here, because, you know, there's a bunch of people that experience this every day on the phone. So if you have anything to share, just raise your hand and we can unmute you.
So I think Ibrahim raised his hand.
Okay. Okay, I think you're unmuted, Ibrahim.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. It's just a comment to just really say, yeah, I totally support the way to lead when you're talking about the architecture within the AMP product. Because what I have seen so far is customers obviously are getting more and more mature on the EDR and the approach that is so different nowadays than what we grew up with, the antivirus industry. And I think it helps in 2 fronts. A, to really explain how different we are and how we are actually leveraging the data set that we actually have at Cisco at large. But also it explains the product, how it works, the underlying guts of what makes AMP a great product. And that's the only way really to move away from feature comparison and AV and AMP comparison, is to really say, listen, this is how we approach security, and this is what makes up the product that you are intending to look into as a replacement to or upgrade to your existing infrastructure. So this is, I think, is a good way to definitely change the power struggle against the established traditional organizations, the Symantec and the McAfee of the world, etc. And I think it's a good way to have a mature conversation and lead the conversation rather than just fall into the bucket of, you know, do you have this or do you have that, or why don't you have this, etc. So just a comment to add to what you've already said and what Eric has said earlier.
Good point. Thanks, Ibrahim. Yeah, I think the other thing I took away was kind of to that point, you know, once we start having conversations with customers, and, you know, let's say you have customer A that has Symantec and is looking at something else to kind of augment that, kind of a play where they want to keep what they have in place, but they want to augment it. That's kind of one conversation. And then I think more and more the second conversation is, hey, can we just replace what you have as your kind of legacy traditional antivirus with ours? And the data point I'll draw to is we had one customer yesterday that one brought up that, hey, how come I'm getting all these quarantine failures? I'm running Symantec and AMP. And then another customer chimed in and said, well, the best thing I ever did was to get rid of Symantec and just use AMP, because now I don't have this contention between two products on, you know, things like quarantine failure, et cetera, et cetera. So said, hey, I saved, you know, 6 figures, life is easier. And so I think we're getting into the state where customers are, you know, where everybody's kind of converging, and customers more and more are looking at converging and you know, having a single agent rather than kind of classic EPP and classic EDR. So I think the conversation that Brian had and the conversation that Thorsten had is certainly relevant when we kind of guide our customers through that process of, hey, do you want to run us in lieu of something else, or, you know, is there some requirement that you have with your existing endpoint, like, I don't know, USB controls, et cetera, where you still need to maintain that for some period of time. So.
Yeah, that's a great call out, Doug. I think we're seeing a lot more. I was on a call this morning with a customer, and they have Sophos, Cylance, and Carbon Black. We're in the process of taking out the Carbon Black because the renewal is March 2nd, I think, and you know, oddly enough, they did the testing as a full-blown EDR and EPP test against, you know, Sophos, Cylance, you know, CrowdStrike, Carbon Black, and we actually did really well. Actually, we would top score on the detection piece and the protection piece, both. But they're looking to consolidate. Now they're doing it a slow roll because of when the renewal times are up for each one of the products. And we kind of talked about, you know, what that plan is and how to do it. But yeah, that's exactly what we're seeing in the field by a lot of customers right now is just, you know, hey, how do I consolidate this down to one? And I think it's a great power play for Cisco to be able to say, hey, look, let us help you reduce that cost, and you can use that money that you'd be saving towards the gaps in other areas of security that you don't have today.
Absolutely. Any other thoughts from, sorry, I think, Thorsten, you went through your deck already, right? So the balance of the time we have for kind of questions and answers. Can anybody hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Doug.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Thorsten is done with presentation.
Okay.
I think we got Q&A time now for anything that comes up.
Okay. Does anyone have any examples of conversations they've had with customers around, you know, are they going to replace what they have, or any strategies around that we've been talking about? You guys want to bring up? Okay. Well, it sounds like, you know, is there anything else that we covered that people have questions that they want to chime in on? Going once, going twice? Okay.
So, folks, tomorrow we've got, I'm sorry, don't cut you off. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to prime the pump for tomorrow. So tomorrow we've got 4 hours on your schedule. We've got about 2.5 or 2 3/4 hours of content. We want to make tomorrow as dynamic and interactive as possible. We're going to be talking about deployment, best practices, some strategies around getting stuff installed, and rolling out the endpoint connector. And so we're hoping that, you know, you guys come with questions, either from past deployments, things you've done in the lab that you've got questions about, use cases and things like that. We've got a ton of content to roll through, but we've got a lot of space built in for Q&A, and we're going to give you a couple breaks because 4 hours is a long time to just keep talking and try to plow through WebEx. But if you can stay connected tomorrow as long as possible, we're going to roll through some great content, introduce some documentation to you that we've been working on across the CSV, TME, Tier 3, and Advanced Services teams around deployment strategies and best practices. Again, 4 hours on your schedule. We may not go the full 4, but if you guys come with questions and we can make it interactive, we will certainly be here for the full 4 hours and ready to talk to you.
Absolutely, because we even though we did this virtual, we definitely want you guys to ask whatever questions that you feel you need help with. I think the secret sauce we've always had is, you know, kind of making it kind of an open forum, if you will, where people could ask whatever question they want, and then we could spend some time discussing it, debating it, what have you, because everybody's got a good idea in this case. So that's all I got.
Hey, Doc, Eric, I think we have one question from Aaron. Could you guys please unmute him?
Aaron, okay.
Thanks.
All right, thank you. So I don't know if this is the perfect setting for this question, but I was going to ask it on AMP
Go for it, Aaron. Go for it.
Sorry. I have a customer who recently reported a set of files came through their email security appliances that were looked at by AMP. They were not submitted to ThreatGrid, and they were marked as low risk. And then probably within an hour, I believe, after delivery, they were retrospectively convicted by AMP. Their question to me came in the form of can I create a rule to force this particular kind of file, which was Word documents, to be submitted to ThreatGrid? And unfortunately, that's not possible within the ESA. You have to basically rely on the pre-classification. But in the course of kind of looking at the incident, I was trying to understand why a Word document that did have an embedded executable, I was able to find it within AMP tools and within ThreatGrid, had embedded executable and so on, why it would pass pre-classification and not be submitted to ThreatGrid. There were some other sort of risky-looking characteristics of the file that weren't necessarily requiring dynamic analysis to discover. So we do have a support case open on it. I just want to see if there's any comment or insight on it.
I'll take that.
Yeah, I agree.
I've seen it. To start with another case, it was Endpoint. So there is a new class of file that is just kind of come out recently. It looks like a doc. However, if you actually do the magic file test on the file, it actually is just XML. So I still got it because I was playing with it yesterday. It is an XML file that is basically just an ASCII file with carriage returns line feed. So it's not technically a Word document by definition. So when we actually do the magic test against it, it actually doesn't show up as a Word document. It just shows up as ASCII text, which we don't check today. That being said, the ClamAV engine, which is what actually does the test to figure out what the file type is, the updated version of that, which on the endpoint was 621, by the way, actually does check for that new file type. We've not looked at it. It's not been updated in the cloud because they're still doing some testing. So we're hoping to have that rolled out here fairly soon, but I don't have an ETA on it because it just literally came up in the last week or so. So we probably need to kind of push that a little bit on our side, but that's what you're seeing there, Aaron.
Okay, could I just have the support case and kind of collaborate on that with someone in this community to just make sure that that is actually what they're seeing and so on?
Yep, I'll almost guarantee you that I was on with the RET team and Tier 3 tech or Tier 3 support this morning about it. So I will forward that over to you.
Okay, very good. And somebody here I could escalate to or include on the support case?
You can include me on it, and I'll help out. I've been party in the middle of it, so I'll be glad to help out any way I can.
Awesome, thank you.
Yep.
Hey, Ibrahim, if you can hear me, the only place air gap mode was dropped was from the virtual implementation of private cloud. So meaning if you're running private cloud as a virtual machine on a hypervisor, then it requires proxy mode. If you're going to be running private cloud on UCS, then yes, you'll still have full air gap mode where you have to download the Protect DB and keep that thing updated one way or another. But that's the go forward plan. That when you're running private cloud on a hypervisor as a guest operating system, proxy mode is going to be the way you have to run it.
Yeah, and the reason for that, kind of Eric said, is so the point is we do have private cloud on UCS. The size, I think the size, guys, correct me if I'm wrong, of the original database download was somewhere around 32 gig. So
it was about
in an air gap,
7 or 8 DVDs.
Okay.
It was crazy big. Yep.
Massive. So what we found is, trying to get that initial update on the virtual appliance was pretty much a very difficult process. So that's why, on the UCS box, we actually ship that initial kind of Protect DB, which gets around that, initial problem of getting a massive amount of data updated. So that's why it's
Let's see. I don't see any more hands raised, but I don't want to rush it. I did not mention, folks, that tomorrow will be recorded. Today is recorded. Tomorrow will be recorded also.
okay.
All right, folks.
Appreciate
the time.
Thanks, everybody. And just go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, go ahead. No. You can close it out.
Yeah. So I mean, just like I said, really trying to make this interactive. There's no silly questions here because I'm sure someone else is thinking it. So just like Eric said earlier, bring your questions tomorrow. We purposely kind of built in extra time in this just to kind of drive discussion. And the thought process is, yes, we could sit there and talk to you for 2 hours or 4 hours, but people tend to learn a lot better when it's more of a discussion and questions. So appreciate your help in that. And I think Eric, we're pretty much a wrap for today, right?
Yep, that's it for today.
Okay. Well, thanks, everybody, and thanks to the presenters. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Thorsten. And thanks for all the questions.
Cool. Talk to you tomorrow, folks.
Okay, ciao.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.